Good afternoon, everyone. This is Pamela Bouchard. I'm with the American Traffic Safety Services Association. Thank you for joining us today. ATSA is a trade association located in Virginia. We have over 1,500 members that make up the traffic safety services industry. We have public agency members, contractors, manufacturers, and suppliers. ATSA offers a number of different benefits to our members, to include conferences, training. We have a big convention is coming up in Tampa in February of 2022, so be sure to check that out. We have a chapter network that allows our members to participate in 28 chapters across the country. Most of our chapters meet 3 to 4 times a year. They meet either virtually or in person, and some hybrid options as well. We offer a number of different educational webinars throughout the year. As like today, we've got the HFST, and a number of our other committees are offering webinars, if not the end of this year, beginning next year. We have a number of different publications that we offer our members, both through email as well as a magazine that gets mailed out 6 times a year. So if you're not a member, we hope that you will check us out and visit our website at atssa.com. Thank you, and enjoy your webinar.
Thanks, Pamela. My name is Rylan Potter. I'm the chair of ATSA's High Friction Surface Treatment Council. To give you guys a short background on the High Friction Surface Treatment Council, it's a group of agency, industry, and research stakeholders. We work together to assist policymakers and practitioners to both better understand the impact of friction demand on roadway safety and the correct selection and implementation of high friction surface treatments to improve safety at high-risk locations. Our meetings focus on the role of friction and safety, innovative treatments to improve safety, developing policies and specs related to enhanced friction treatments, and sharing new research and best practices. We encourage you to take a look at ATSA's website for additional resources, to become a friend of the council, or as Pamela said, to join an upcoming meeting to learn more about the work we are doing. To briefly touch on the webinar, today's webinar is the second in the HFST Council's quarterly series. The previous webinar, held in partnership with Agile Assets, talked about strategies for implementing the safe system approach using friction data. Our next webinar, which will be held in concert with the ATSA annual meeting, which takes place from February 11th through 15th in Tampa, will delve more into HFST installation requirements. Some logistics and reminders for today's webinar: we will have a 45-minute moderated discussion followed by a question and answer period. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, but will have an opportunity to ask questions and interact with panelists at the end. If you have a question along the way, please put them into the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of our presentation. And everyone who is registered today will receive a recording and will have access to the recording at ATSA's website for the event. Finally, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please log off and log back on, or send us a message in the chat. So with that, I will hand it over to Dave Merritt, today's moderator.
All right, well, thank you, Ryland, and welcome to everybody who's joined us online. We're excited about this webinar. As Ryland mentioned, the focus of today is going to be on site selection for high friction surface treatments, and in a future webinar, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the lessons learned regarding installation and of the treatment itself. So just a little bit about Transtec. Transtec is a pavement engineering firm, specializes in research, testing, and design. We've done extensive research on testing related to pavement surface characteristics, so friction and texture, smoothness, tire pavement noise. We're pavement nerds basically, and we like anything related to pavement surface characteristics. And so high friction surface treatment's been something that we've been passionate about for several years. We really got involved in earnest with high friction surface treatments probably in the mid to late 2000s. We helped FHWA with their Surface Enhancements of Horizontal Curves program, which was used to promote the use of HFST as a safety countermeasure through a series of demonstration projects. Through that, we helped with the site selection, installation, testing, and monitoring of more than 24 demonstration projects in about a dozen states. More recently, we were involved with a study to develop crash modification factors for high friction surface treatments as part of the FHWA low cost safety improvements pooled fund effort. And currently, we're actually working with FHWA to update their curve selection. We're rebranding it generically the high friction surface treatment site selection and installation guide and the FAQ document that the FHWA currently has for that. There's also going to be a pocket guide for inspection and some training materials that come with that. So that's all in process right now and should be out hopefully early spring at the latest. We've also been involved with the High Friction Surface Council since 2011, and we helped develop the HFST High Friction Surface Treatment Installation Inspection training course that is used nationally. So that's a little bit about Transtec. With that, I want to go ahead and allow our participants, our distinguished panelists, to introduce themselves. So the three states which you'll hear from today are states with mature, what I would call mature high friction surface treatment programs. So they've used, as you'll hear, they've been using high friction surface treatment for a number of years. Have a large, each of these states have large programs with dozens or hundreds of installations, and so a lot of experience with that. And we really wanted to hear from them in terms of their agency's processes for site selection. So let's go ahead and allow our panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start in the order shown on your screen there, and we'll start with Jason Hershock with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation.
Hello, Jason Hershock. As it says, I'm manager of the Safety Engineering and Risk Management Unit at Pennsylvania Department of Transportation Central Office. I've worked as a consultant, worked in our central office and through construction materials, and at our district running our traffic units, study and safety unit, and then currently in the role that I am and overseeing probably well over 600 installations of high friction surface treatments across Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Jason. Robert Peterson with the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans.
Hey, Robert Peterson here from Caltrans. I've been with the department 33 years. Right now, I'm the office chief over our local assistance program, overseeing our local HSIP. When I got introduced to high friction was back a number of years when I was in the district, looking at investigations and looking at countermeasures when high friction came my way. So we embraced it at that time and took off with it. But currently I oversee the local HSIP program along with other federal programs. So still involved with safety, but mainly on the local side, helping local agencies with their safety programs.
All right, thank you, Robert. And Mike Vaughn with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. You might need to explain your shirt there in the photo as well.
Oh, it's coming. So yeah, I work with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Specifically, I'm in the Division of Traffic Operations, but I'm one of 3 engineers who administer and oversee our Highway Safety Improvement Program. Been doing that for a little over 7 years now. Prior to that, I worked in our one of our districts in bridge inspection for about 5 years and highway design for 5 years, and a few other little odd and end roles sort of between the bigger moves. I currently live in Kentucky's capital city of Frankfort with my wife, who I affectionately call the regional manager. As you can see from my screenshot on the slide, I'm her assistant, but not, it's the assistant to the regional manager, not assistant regional manager. So kind of an office joke there. That's a show we like to watch together. But like the other 2 panelists, happy to be here today to talk about Kentucky's experience with high friction surface.
All right, thanks, Mike. All right, with those introductions, we're going to go ahead and jump into the questions here. And as Ryland mentioned, sort of the format for today will just be, I'll ask a question of our panelists and allow them 2 or 3 minutes to answer. And like I say, if you have any questions that you'd like to hear from them, we have about 15 minutes set aside at the end to allow you to ask questions, and we'll present those to the panelists as well. So we're going to start off with the first question, really just kind of a background information. So to each of the states here, can you tell us when your agency first used high friction surface treatment as a safety countermeasure, kind of what was your first experience? How did that lead to your current usage of it? And really, how large is your high friction program today? And we'll start with Jason.
All right. So our first time that we used this was in 2007, June 2007, in our Northampton County area along Route 611. It was a location that had about, I think it had 21 wet road crashes, varying severities, but a lot of serious injury and fatality and all that kind of stuff. So it was a need to address that. We piloted this high friction surface treatment. It was all hand applied at that time before there were all the different options to install it that we have now. And I was just checking the crash data before this just to make sure, but not from when we installed it in 2008, we didn't have a crash at that location, any type of crash at that location until 2017. So it's pretty successful, and it was only one basically property damage only crash with a motorcycle. So it's a very good pilot that we had today. We are probably over around 600 locations. Our program really started to take off around 2012 to 2013 when several other districts really started to implement high friction surface treatment at multiple locations. All
right, thanks. And Robert, same question to you. When is your first application? How did that lead to your current usage, and how large is the Caltrans program today?
So like Jason, it started out back in 2008, and it really, I think the genesis was a presentation that came when industry came to Caltrans and gave us a presentation about high friction. And once I found out it was non-proprietary, I was all ears. And then from there, we saw a webinar from actually the state of Pennsylvania on that success that they were mentioned there. And from there, I was like, well, this is too good to be true. And but I was definitely convinced that this is something we could use at that time. So we also did a pilot that summer. And then from there, I think a year later, I think there was another pilot that was a nationwide, that another district was involved with another curve, another problem curve. And that was also around that time, maybe in 2009, I can't remember the timeline. From there, when we saw the results, especially at that one down at called Laurel Curve, when you have a curve with a name on it, you know it's a problem. But literally the accidents disappeared. It was one of those things where you're just amazed that something went from a problem area to zero. And so really from there is when then we started initiating, getting it going. And since so far we've implemented on the state side of HCIP and also the local side, since we have two separate programs, which I oversee the local. And so local agencies are very much installing it on their local roads, which is good to see. And I would say right now we are probably over 500 locations statewide, including local agencies.
All right, thank you, Robert. And Mike, same question to you.
So Kentucky, we put our first high friction surface treatment application down in 2009. There were two particular curves in our Louisville district, District 5. It's around the Louisville, Kentucky region. Each of those curves had just been a hot spot for crashes for several years, and it got to a point where we were averaging about 2 crashes every month. The vast majority of those crashes were occurring on wet pavement. We weren't able to do any kind of skid testing with our lock wheel skid trailer to get a friction reading. The curvature at those curves was just too sharp. It wasn't safe to operate the skid trailer in those curves. But where we were having so many wet pavement crashes, we really felt that friction was a contributing factor. We had learned about high friction in that 2008, 2009 timeframe. So right off the bat, we immediately thought of these two particular curves, which had kind of been a a problem for the recent past, and we applied to high friction and just immediately started seeing really good results. It was quite a while, like the other states have mentioned. It was many months before we had even saw another crash. So, you know, we felt really good that we were getting really good results right out of the gate. So we began screening our roadway network for other locations that had kind of both a high frequency and high percentage of wet roadway crashes. You know, as we had those successes and began looking for other locations kind of simultaneously, we created or started going through the hoops, if you will. It seems like everything in government can take a little time, but we began creating an on-call contract with a high friction surface treatment vendor kind of at the same time and throughout 2009, and got that contract in place so that we could hit the ground running, so to speak, with installations in 2010. And, you know, been installing high friction quite a bit ever since. And we, a little bit smaller state than the other two, but we have a little over 175 high friction sites in Kentucky now.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Mike. All right, so dialing in a little bit more on the site selection process. That's what really the focus of this webinar. What process does your agency use to select sites for HFST deployment, and how is that process, if it's evolved over time, how has it evolved over time? And again, I'll start with Jason on this question.
Okay, yep. So you heard a lot of the wet road crashes. So that's where we really started with the wet road crashes. So we would get clusters for those. We would perform skid tests at those locations with a lock wheels trailer. And then the skid test numbers were low, the site would become eligible as a candidate. Over time, we've noticed that not all locations with wet road crashes warrant HFST, and I think we're going to get into that later on here. But at some locations, these locations were fine, so we didn't have to pursue the friction issue there. We screen also not just for wet road crashes, but we also screen for fixed object crashes, single vehicle run off the road type crashes, lane departure crashes to do that. We've also expanded in recent years to intersections, locations where you have a steep downgrade approaching stop signs and signals. Rear ends are typically the type of crash we're trying to avoid. Maybe crashes that involve sliding into a pedestrian crosswalk. So we want to get the friction surface there before the crosswalk area. And then we also want to prevent the vehicle that slides out into the intersection and hits into traffic that's full speed on a throughfare. We have done some studies that show it's working well, and researched different materials to see, obviously, as we do something, everybody, is there some way we can do it cheaper? Is there something that we can do it cheaper? So we've had a pretty good materials unit that's tested a lot of different ones, and we found nothing compares to calcined bauxite, so that's the only thing we allow for that. And now I should say the latest thing that we've evolved with is now it's part of our pavement manual for the state. Gives guidance to our district pavement engineers. So it's not just exclusively the safety engineers that are trying to get this product onto the road. We have our construction and materials folks, the safety folks, our pavement engineers have all really bought into the positive effects of high friction surface treatment.
Thank you, Jason. Robert, same question to you. What's your process for site selection? How's that evolved over time?
So with Caltrans, and I'll talk also about our local agencies, but with Caltrans, we've had a process where we do mandatory investigations. It's a list that gets generated by headquarters and then gets sent out to the districts. And so we call it a table C, but it's a hotspot location where there's mandatory investigations and response, whether action, no action. But we also have one where it's called table C wet, and it's an annual report, and it's not a quarterly report, but an annual report. So a lot of our sites that were high friction is selected results from that list. And And so before high friction HFST came into our toolbox, we were really stuck with either pavement grinding, looking at the drainage, or maybe applying open grade asphalt concrete, which is a kind of a surface where you have the pavement surface has more voids, and it helps with reducing accidents, but it was very limited on where we could place it. Couldn't place it in coarse freeze thaw locations. So high friction was when that came around, that really became a recommendation that we could put in our reports without saying, oh, we can't do anything here, and then move on. We're kind of a litigious state, so sometimes we're a little uncomfortable saying we can't do nothing. So high friction was one of those things where we a lot of our locations are results from that list. As far as how it's evolved, it's still a lot of our friction locations are from that list. We are moving to putting it to any dry locations. It actually is a strategic highway safety plan action to where we will basically have it to where now it's part of that, as well as a consideration. Sometimes engineers are hesitant to use something if it's not actually in writing. So that has helped with that as a consideration at any locations, wet or dry. As far as our local agencies, we've incorporated it within our local ASIP guidance, and a lot of local agencies have embraced it. They're the ones that have to provide, they do the site selection themselves. And I would say a majority of their locations through their process, how they do their site selection is it had been on curves, and a lot of times it's also city streets approaching signalized intersections where we've been seeing them placing high friction.
All right, thank you, Robert. And Mike, same question for you. I know Federal FHWA published a case study kind of documenting your site selection process, and I think it's even evolved further since then. So tell us a little bit about your site selection process.
Yeah, our site selection has it's definitely evolved in a few different times. In sort of the early years, sort of the beginning, we would divide the entire network up into 3,000-foot segments. And then we would essentially count the number of wet pavement crashes in each segment, and then sort those segments by the highest number of wet pavement crashes. From there, we would kind of look at just some rough windshield estimate type budget numbers just to see how many sites we think we could get through with the available funding. And then we'd start doing site investigations on those prioritized segments. As we would get into those investigations, they were 3,000 foot long, the segments were, so they're on some roads that could have several different curves sort of back to back to back. And so we would take a kind of a deep dive into the crash data to try to see if it was one specific curve or multiple curves in the segment. A lot of times it would be just one curve. Sometimes it'd be multiple curves, but we'd try to pinpoint which curve or curves appeared to have the largest cluster of those wet pavement crashes. During that investigation, we do field reviews, and this is kind of one of our, I guess, key lessons learned, not necessarily from site selection, but just when it comes to installation and application of high friction in general, but is check the pavement condition and look for other possible reasons that the wet pavements could be crashing. Maybe it's more of a drainage issue and not so much a friction issue. If there's water ponding or pooling on the roadway for whatever reason, clogged pipe, clogged ditch, that could be a different solution than high friction surface. Kind of circling back to site selection, in the 2012 timeframe, we kind of evolved how we went about site selection. We had been learning about safety performance functions from the release of the 2010 Highway Safety Manual. Around mid to late 2012, working with the University of Kentucky, we had developed some state-specific SPFs to sort of screen for potential high friction locations. We developed an SPF that only utilized wet roadway departure crashes, and we, similar to the prior method, we divided the network into 3/10 of a mile segments, so about 1,500 feet segments, but even length segments, and the segments that came back with having higher excess expected crash frequency were how we would prioritize and start kind of doing that project level or site specific investigation to find which candidate sites would fit within the budget. And we're good, you know, the existing pavement was good enough to accept high friction, or we didn't feel like there was some other issue creating the wet pavement projects. We're still utilizing SPFs, but one thing that has changed, sort of the third evolution, is how we go about segmenting the network. Over the years, the cabinet has developed a pretty good curve database, and you know, what we have found is, through our experience, most of our installations for high friction were on curves or curved sections of a ramp. And so we've developed an SPF that only utilizes curved segments of roadway, but it looks at the curve as a whole. And so, you know, sometimes when you're just doing random segmentation of some even interval, you'll split a curve in half and you may miss a hot spot because half the crashes are in the previous segment and the other half of the crashes are in the next segment. And so by redefining how our segmentation occurred, by letting it be centered around the PC and PT of our curves, that allowed us to better ensure we weren't missing opportunities or hotspots. We still do a field review. Like I say, that we still believe that's a very important component of sort of that tail end of site selection. You don't want to just necessarily see a hotspot of wet pavement crashes and just make the assumption that high friction is the answer. You know, so it's part of the site selection process, but it's more at the project level review. Similar to the other states, we also only allow calcined bauxite. We also don't allow hand application except for just really oddball areas where the automated truck just can't get to those areas when it's applying the high friction, which is really rare. So 99% of all our high friction does go down by an automated truck.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Next question, and we've heard alluded to some of this a little bit, but maybe just kind of boil some of this down for us. You know, based on your experience with site selection, what are some of your lessons learned of when high friction is not the best countermeasure for a particular site? Maybe your crash data showed that it was, or your screening process showed that it was, but what are some of your lessons learned that when that you figured out that high friction really wasn't the best treatment for that site? So again, start with you, Jason.
So again, like you're saying, not all locations require high friction surface treatments. This was sort of hit on by some of the other panelists here. It's been so successful that everybody wants to use it now. Everybody wants to sort of jump on the high friction surface bandwagon of success. And sometimes it's used where maybe we should actually make a geometric change, and we have the ability to do that. So we are trying to tell everybody, you know, it's great, but it doesn't need to be used everywhere. Similar to what was said earlier by Mike, there's not all locations that have wet road crashes require high friction surface treatment. There's locations where we have good friction. We've gone out on rainy days and find it's rather easy to get a pool car and go out and look at stuff on a rainy day. Not a lot of people want to do that. And we go out and we can find places where the inlet is above the curb. So we have to flood the road out first to get it to drain, and some crazy things like that we've found. So that, you know, we have that in there. We've also found that some places people aren't making sure that the structure of the pavement was sound. So we don't want to put it over rutted pavements or anything like that, because you'll still allow water to fill the ruts. So we have come up with ways to work with our maintenance crews to do small mill and fill jobs before, maybe like the fall, and then come back in the spring and actually do the high friction surface treatment with the contractor.
Thank you, Jason. Robert, same question to you. What are some of the lessons learned related to site selection and where not to apply it?
Like Jason, you know, it really comes down to the pavement, you know, condition. What we have found, unlike Jason, I think some of our districts like to go to the geometric solution first instead of going to the high friction. I think they we supplement our HSIP program with other funds for HSIP, so we spend a lot more, and so I think some of the districts see this as an opportunity of, hey, we've got an opportunity, let's go with the bigger fix, and so sometimes it's just trying to get them to say, hey, how about if we go with high friction now, and we could spend those funds elsewhere. So I think that's some of the struggle right now is just that of, you know, going with something that you could start seeing a benefit right now instead of 4 years from now. So, but yeah, I think also it's just we have found just mainly just getting the surface prepared right is where we have found the failures. And I know this is not the question itself, but that's really where we saw the issues. But yeah, it's one of those where I think trying to get them to accept high friction to go with first is and it, for the most part around California here, I think it's, you know, we have a dry environments, we have wet environments, and so really I think, you know, some of the lessons is I think high friction could be placed more than I think some of the districts want, but yeah, really the pavement surface itself, making sure that it's probably could be placed more than maybe what they're thinking, from even the pavement cracking. Sometimes they say, well, it's too cracked, we don't want to, and then if somebody that's really an expert in high friction takes a look at it, like, well, that's not bad, you know, I mean, it's I think high friction can work, and so sometimes I think they shy away from it. They think maybe the pavement is too bad, but that's kind of where we're at with it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. And Mike, same question. What are some of your lessons learned?
Similar to what Jason and Robert have both mentioned, Kentucky's seen similar and kind of a little bit different vein. It's still in the vein of not all wet crashes are due to friction, you know, that, like I said, it could be ponding water or whatever, but when we're doing our site level project specific investigation, we generally read all the crash narratives of the wet pavement crashes. And we've had a few sites over the years that when you read those narratives and kind of get into those details of kind of what really was the leading factor of the crash, you find that it just so happened that it was raining that day. A funny example is there was a curve where it seemed like people either were deliberately running off the road to miss Farmer John's cattle that kept getting out, or a deer that was just standing in the road, and this was the same curve, one where one of the neighbors that lived on the road was riding their lawnmower down the road, and just when that car came up on him, he was going slow through the curve and didn't quite see them. It didn't have a lot of sight distance with the curve, and so they deliberately ran off the road to miss these objects or other people in the road. And like I said, it just happened to be raining. And there was another one where the driver told the officer that, well, I was driving along and my front left wheel just fell off. And so, you know, had nothing to do with friction. And so to me, when you hear from Jason and Robert and sort of at my stories here, is there's just a lot of details you need to pay attention to. If you get too much tunnel vision that, hey, high friction's the holy grail of improvement for wet crashes, and you forget to look at some of those details, you may miss some important things that show you, oh, it's not really a friction issue here, it's something else. many times it will be the correct solution. And that's where you run that sort of risk of falling into that trap of you go through a lot of the same analysis motions and you end up landing on high friction. We sometimes forget to pay attention to those little nuanced details that will occasionally steer the choice of countermeasure in a different direction. So that'd be my encouragement to everybody as they look at their sites, is don't forget to look at all those little details as you go.
Thanks, Mike. Next question I wanted to talk about is, I think a lot of times maybe a site's initially selected for high friction surface treatment and the application is successful, and it reduces crashes, but I guess there's the question of what happens when that high friction's reached the end of its useful life, or we had a question about pavement resurfacing schedule. How do you plan that into a resurfacing schedule? And I guess the question is how do you, I guess maybe the simple way to ask is how do you make sure that you continue the high friction at the application of that location? Because I know that you all have had long enough programs where you've had high friction sites that have had to be removed and replaced just due to reaching the end of useful life. So what's the process for making sure that you can maintain high friction at that site, or I guess justifying a reapplication at that location? And so Jason, I don't know if you have any direct experience with that you could share with us.
Yeah, so I would just jump one step back to that to make sure you may have the site last long. We found educating our construction inspection team on the do's and don'ts of application of high friction surface treatment has paid off greatly, to the point where they're proactive and have pointed certain things out to us. One of our methods has staff out there using basically squeegees to make sure there's even applications, and they noticed some of those over time will curve and will not allow for that. So the key to maintaining it is making sure it's installed properly the first time, and to take the time with your construction staff to teach them this is what they need. They don't know what they're doing unless you teach them. And some folks that have been in construction can have a lot of pride and don't want to hear, hey, somebody from highway safety or some pavement engineer needs to teach them how to do this. But overall, that has been a good investment. We've had a very good involvement with our materials folks. So we've always been constantly monitoring if there is any deleterious effects to high friction surface treatment. And since we're using the calcined bauxite only, we haven't seen any of that. I think, unlike many other states, have a maintenance fund for our safety program. We put a lot of our high friction surface treatment down with our HSIP funds, but we have what's called a 715 fund, which comes out of our highway maintenance funds. We get $10 million a year for the whole state, and then it's allocated to the different counties. So some counties get a lot, some counties get just a little bit, but they are now able to use those 715 funds when locations basically pavement cycles up, to use that to pay to have the high friction surface treatment replaced when the paving cycle's up and we hire a contractor to come through. We've already had it though where the project managers for the new pavement projects just incorporate that cost into the project because it's so successful. We don't want to have to answer for why we didn't put it back. So we haven't had to try to ask to use HSIP funds for maintenance. So we've been very fortunate on that side.
Yeah, that's very good. Interesting. Robert, same question. Any insight on that from California's perspective?
Yeah, I wish I had what Jason had. No. So as this is the area I think has been kind of we're at the point now where, I think we do have some safety engineers out in our district that have replaced it in certain locations. That's what I've heard. The longevity, of course, is a big concern as far as making sure that when you place it, that it will last long. But we've had some turnover in some districts, some of our districts, and I think that the question on maintenance has come up in maintaining it, and what happens. Our staff, our maintenance folks are not trained, and so because of that, I've been seeing raising some issues where some are not selecting it because of those issues. So I'm definitely taking a chapter from Jason's state, and fortunately we do have a new program that is starting up in our maintenance that actually focusing on safety. And so I am going to push to carve out some of those funding to make it available for in case a location does fail, that they can go to use those funds to maintain and replace those sites as well. And I think that should help reduce those fears and for them to not even considering it at the beginning because of the maintenance concerns. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. But I do know a lot of the locations, there's been several that they've, through the course of overlays or whatever, they'll put it back. But I think there's a little stovepipe of our funding is a little bit of a concern of I'm not using my funds for high friction, in the pavement folks. So that there's some workings together that we need to work together on. But I think overall it's not. Some of our districts are more progressive than others, but some of those things that the questions that we've been hearing, we've got to try to address. And I think we've got a good path forward. And I think, what we're doing with the HM4, I think hopefully will help.
Great. Thank you, Robert. And Mike, how about you? What are some of those things you learned in terms of prioritizing and reapplication, that type of thing?
I think Robert's right. I'd love to have some dedicated maintenance funding for safety like Jason has, but I also think Jason made another good point that, one of the first steps in getting along life and reducing how much maintenance there would be is, make sure everybody's got the training they need to get it installed correctly the first time. The better you get it installed, the longer it'll last. In Kentucky, we have sites that are over 11 years old now. So well over that initial 7-8 years that a lot of the industry thought was a realistic lifespan. We've far exceeded that, but I think a lot of that comes from really hammering home all the important aspects of, getting the binder put down correctly and making sure that the calcined bauxite goes down at the right time so that you get that proper embedment to get the result you want, but not poor embedment where you shed a lot of your rock off or aggregate off over a short time frame. When it comes to reapplication in Kentucky, which is similar to a lot of our decision making, is we start with it depends. We really try to consider friction demand and friction supply. And, I hope everybody kind of understands those concepts, but just real quick in a nutshell, friction demand's related to the speed at which a driver takes a curve and then the geometric features of that curve. So smaller radius, less super, things like that, and higher speeds will all work against you. And that driver will demand a lot of friction in order for their car to remain, kind of adhered to the pavement as they traverse a curve. Friction supply obviously is how much friction can the pavement give. We have a lot of limestone in Kentucky. That's pretty much what the vast majority of our asphalt mixes utilize is limestone aggregate, and about 90 to 95% of our pavements are asphalt. So just a lot of our pavement surface has asphalt aggregate in it, limestone aggregate in it. Limestone, as everybody knows, is susceptible to polishing. So a lot of the locations where we've applied high friction has typically, at least from all the evidence we have, is that those pavements had decent friction when they were put down, but for whatever reason, maybe got a little bit worse batch of rock for certain curves or stretches of road than typical, and those places polished relatively quickly. Pavement was still in good condition, just polished. So applied high friction and had some really good results. But kind of the stance we take for those curves that aren't quite so challenging, from just having a lot of really high speed drivers trying to take a really tight curve, we felt like the deficiency came about more on the friction supply side. And so we view it as, well, when we put a new surface down, when it finally comes time to resurface that road, that there's no guarantee that next next future surface will polish as quickly. And so we generally don't automatically put the high friction back. We know we've had an issue, so we really monitor things closely, so that if that site does begin to repolish in a short number of years, then we're back out there replacing it. Some of the few spots where we've seen, well, hey, the friction demand is just really high here. It's just likely to need high friction is on our ramps, primarily our teardrop loop ramps that are a lot of our clover leaf interchanges and partial clovers. And a lot of times the deceleration length as they approach that loop ramp is kind of short. And so drivers, even drivers who consider themselves safe or careful tend to come in kind of fast on those curves. And so the demand is always high. And in those locations, we have either through the resurfacing project or some other means, it's primarily been the resurfacing project. We've put the high friction back. Similar to something Robert mentioned was we and Jason, like we have some people that want to forego maybe a more grand improvement and just automatically go with high friction, and other folks that they want to say, hey, well, we're realigning that curve, it's in the 6-year plan, it's 5 or 6 years out, so we just aren't going to do anything. And so there's an opportunity to put high friction down in the short term until you get the bigger realignment. But you also don't want people to, when they have a project that maybe has a location that has a little bit of a challenging aspect to get a realignment, don't let them fall to just automatically putting high friction and walking off. Like, that's a tool there to help you, but you don't want to get, if you can help it, you don't want to get to where you're having to put high friction down, every 10 or 15, 20 years that you resurface the road. If you can mitigate the underlying issues that are creating a lot of that, too much friction demand and not enough friction supply, then that's really the ultimate solution, is to make sure that you have a roadway that can have more supply than the friction demand that's being asked of it.
Right. Excellent points there, Mike. I did want to ask one more question before we jump into the audience questions. And again, I encourage you, if you have questions for our panelists, go ahead and enter those in the chat pod. But the last question I wanted to ask from our standpoint to each of the panelists, and this may be a quick answer, but there's been a lot of discussion lately about systemic applications for safety countermeasures. So trying to get ahead of the problem instead of reacting and applying high friction where we've had high crashes in the past. The systemic deployment really focuses on looking at risk factors and trying to get out ahead of the crashes before they occur. And so I think there's a few states that have looked at it for high friction surface treatment, but I'm just curious from each of our panelists here, has your agency used a systemic process for high friction surface treatment, or do you foresee that potentially in the future? Jason, I'll start with you again.
So I guess we just how we typically put it down, we typically put our high friction surface down in large district-wide contracts. So we're doing dozen plus locations typically. So if we're at a location that has the crashes, but we also have a curve that has very similar characteristics, we will allow that to be installed at those locations. So we do embrace the systemic option. One thing I know we've done with our network screening, as we've updated it, we've seen crash migration where a previous network screening said to do a project here, we did it, and then we come back and update it and see that crashes have just migrated to curves down the road from it. So systemic approach is going to be very valuable at preventing those kinds of crashes that might migrate somebody. We address crashes at one curve only to watch it go down the road now, because that's where people are going to crash after they make it through that curve that was an issue. So yep, we fully do systemic installation of high friction surface treatments, and we'll continue to do that. And hopefully we'll be at 1,000 locations before too long, as we try to combat Pennsylvania's largest fatality issue for highway safety.
Great, thanks, Jason. Robert, same question for you for Caltrans. Any systemic deployment or plans for it? Or?
Right now, we don't do systemic deployment. We just don't have the the information. I think at this point we do multiple locations, but a lot of them are because maybe investigations resulted in 5 or 6 areas. So that's where high friction will be put down. But it has to be basically from our investigation. So as far as putting it elsewhere, it's not part of our practice. Not saying that it hasn't been done maybe by a district or 1 or 2, but it's not something that's been part of our guidelines. We'd like to get to that point though. We are looking at continuous friction methodology that has been piloted in our state. And so we're at this point of once we get that information back to management and show them the benefits, hopefully they will embrace continuous friction as something we can adopt, and I think it would get a little bit better as far as our road information, curve data, for example, is Mike mentioned. I think from there we can start doing the systemic approach. That's something we have embraced in other areas and even on the local agency side, but we're not there yet, but we hope to be.
Okay, thanks, Robert. And Mike, how about you? Any systemic deployment or plans for that?
So in the past, most of our site selection has been what I would call reactive, primarily reacting to kind of a large number of wet pavement crashes. Last year in 2020, we did begin in Kentucky collecting a significant mileage of continuous friction measurement data. We're currently in the process of tying that continuous friction data with our crash data or roadway data, and kind of going through that systemic process of trying to understand which route types, which roadway features, different attributes, which of those kind of are correlated more with our wet pavement crashes and so crash risk and lower friction areas, and really just trying to determine where on Kentucky's network friction has the largest impact on crash risk. So we are working toward trying to get a systemic process for friction in Kentucky, and then trying to prioritize friction treatment. So high friction surface treatment will definitely be an important countermeasure in this process as we figure out where to apply friction treatments to mitigate the potential risk, not necessarily the high number of crashes, but we're also using this to try to get a sense of what is the right level of treatment. High friction surface, it's called high friction surface because it creates a large amount of friction supply, which is a really good thing. But in certain areas where maybe you have that risk you need to address, but it's not on the upper echelon of crash risk due to friction, then there may be another friction treatment option that's a little bit lower cost that is the right choice for certain sites. So we're really hoping to not only move toward a more systemic approach and a proactive approach, but also trying to right size the treatment option for the different sites, so that we can, similar to what Jason said, Kentucky's got a large roadway departure fatality challenge. Over 64% of our fatalities tend to be roadway departure, and a lot of those can be attributed to skid related issues. And so if we can really expand how we tackle that challenge area and look at all kinds of different opportunities, I think that's our best bet of really making a dent in those roadway departure crashes.
Great, thank you, Mike. So I know we're running short on time. We're gonna try to get through as many of these questions from the audience as we can. I'm gonna ask maybe direct some of these questions. We had a couple of questions related to calcined bauxite aggregate material. And I guess maybe Jason, I'll direct the question to you, or a couple of these questions to you, because I know you said you had looked at some alternative aggregates and evaluated those versus calcined bauxite. So there's a question in cost difference. I don't know if you have any good information on cost difference of a non-calcined bauxite versus calcined bauxite, and also if you have any experience that you can convey in terms of sort of the typical life that you're seeing from a calcined bauxite treatment.
Sure. So our guy that we have a guy that does all that testing. Alberto Medina is my counterpart on the materials side, but I work with him a lot. So we've had several aggregate producers that say they have something that's comparable to calcined bauxite. And so we test it. Our lab has multiple testing methods to, whether it's British wheel or something like that, and to measure for deleterious effects on to see how long it can withstand weathering in Pennsylvania. And none of them have held up, and none of them have been comparable. The only thing that would be something that we have used in the past, we aren't using it anymore, was on our bridge decks. We may have used flint on there. As far as cost, you don't save it. There's really no savings to use a cheaper aggregate. So there's really no benefit to use a cheaper aggregate because it's going to break down quicker and it doesn't have as much friction to it. So there's no benefit to replacing the calcined bauxite. It is the best. It holds up well. Most of your cost is in the binder material that it's putting it down. So yeah, trying to save money through changing the aggregate, you're just not going to see that. You're not going to see a huge cost benefit, if any.
Okay, thanks, Jason. A couple more Pennsylvania questions. You must be popular here, Jason. So there was a question about application to concrete pavement. I think probably all 3 states have had experienced success with applying to concrete pavements and certainly to bridge decks. I don't know if you want to speak to any of that. And Jason, the other question from Pennsylvania was, have you provided any training or education to your agency staff to help make sure that you get that good, proper installation?
So on the concrete, I wish I could share some of the photos I have. But yeah, we not only do we put it on concrete pavements, we put it on our high-speed roads. We put it on freeways. We're not afraid to do that, and we find it holds up quite well. We're getting 8-10 years out of these. Typically, it's when the pavement cycle is coming up is when we're replacing it. I can't think of anything where we had an outright failure where they said, hey, 2 years we gotta do that. We did have a mix-up where a maintenance crew just came through and milled it out because they didn't ask anybody or whatever, like right after we installed it, but that was quickly addressed. So, I mean, that was just miscommunication and a overambitious maintenance crew. So, but yeah, the concrete pavement holds up quite fine. Anytime we see like cracks or that, we go out and check it, and it's typically issues with the concrete pavement itself. It was old or something like that, but we haven't had any issues with putting it on a freeway or concrete pavement. And then what was the second part of that, Dave?
They're asking about training and what if you provide any training to agency staff. You mentioned that the importance of inspectors being trained in order to make sure you get a good application.
Right. So in Pennsylvania, we obviously have a construction season when it's warm, and then when it's cold, it's winter, and we don't construct anything. We just try to plow and keep the road. So during that time, our construction units will have what's called winter schools, where they teach them on different aspects or whatever that are coming up. And so we've got invites to go to those winter schools, and one of the things we started teaching them about is high friction surface treatment, to show the aspects of why it's beneficial. It is low cost, and typically construction inspectors, they see the low cost stuff that's done in safety, and it's not a real big issue to them. But when you start to tell them, hey, when you do this right, this low cost countermeasure does more for highway safety and preventing fatalities and injuries than your bridge projects and everything like that. So we've conveyed that, and it's been successful to the point where we get invited back, and we have a very good relationship with our materials and construction folks in central office and at our lab, who also echo the importance of that, to the point where we have inspectors that will call us up and ask us, hey, we're seeing this, is this something that's being done correctly? So we have a lot of good interaction with that, and yeah, the training pays off.
Great, thank you. I guess maybe one more question. Looking at site selection, is anybody looking at surface characteristics other than friction? Macro texture in particular is as part of the site selection process. I think all of you mentioned about using friction data to at least verify whether a site's a good candidate. Anybody looking at texture or any other parameter?
In Kentucky, we are now, as part of our continuous friction data collection contract, we're also getting macro texture, and we're integrating all that data with our other pavement data that we have and that we collect annually. And so that's a good question, because macro texture in certain instances can be really important to the sort of the crash or safety performance of a pavement surface. The other thing I'll mention too is that's another, when it comes time to install high friction surface, so you put the epoxy binder down first. If that pavement has little to no macro texture, there's really no voids, or like for the epoxy to kind of get no pores or voids for that epoxy to get down into and really grip the pavement. Epoxy don't really bond real well to a surface that's too smooth. So that is something to consider as you're reviewing your site in the field, is if it looks like you've just don't really have much macro texture, you want to check that before you program the construction project, because that, I think some states have had some failure where they just get large areas delaminate because there just wasn't enough macro texture for the epoxy binder to bond to.
We had a couple of questions about before and after studies, and agencies, you apply it, and then of course you want to evaluate the performance. And I know all of your states have looked at that. I know Pennsylvania, you do a benefit cost analysis every year based on crash data. Anybody can, I guess, Jason, maybe I'll start with you. Before and after analysis, this is something I'm guessing that you're evaluating continually, just to make sure you're looking at the after performance with your sites as well.
Right. So yeah, we check our countermeasures, not just high friction surface treatment, but we see what works and what doesn't. And high friction surface treatment is one that definitely jumps out with a high benefit cost. I don't have the chart up in front of me, but I do have this guy Dave Merritt's study up that he did a while ago that shows all the different crash modification factors that came up. So rather than saying what they are, but I mean, some of these, you're reducing crashes by more than 80% on a normal basis. So Dave, I don't know, or anybody else, if you have other stuff to talk about, but I would let Dave talk about his own study.
Well, yeah, I'll mention that we do a benefit cost as well in Kentucky, and most years that when we do it, we get double digit to 1, 10 to 1, 14 to 1 returns on investment. We use SPFs to do the before and after to get, to try to work out some of that regression to the mean effects of when you look at the before and after crashes. But we do it over a 7.5 year period, our benefit cost. So a lot of our high friction sites are lasting well beyond that, but we're just basing it on a projected 7.5 year lifespan. And like I said, we're getting double digit to 1 on a relatively short lifespan. We've had a few years where we've been single digit to 1. I think the lowest was right at 3 to 1. And that's one of the areas where we realize, hey, we may have applied some where we weren't paying attention to the details, and maybe it really wasn't a friction issue. Not that it didn't reduce crashes fairly decent, it just wasn't quite as good as what we've normally seen, because similar to what Jason said, Kentucky's had a lot of our sites looked at for CMF calculation, and just rural 2-lane roads, the CMF is I can't remember the exact number, 0.2 something, so 80% reduction on rural 2-lane roads. And for ramp sections, we've been up in the low 90, like 92, 91% reduction in wet pavement crashes. So we've had extremely good success in Kentucky, and we really think it's on the FHWA's proven safety countermeasure list for a reason. It really is. It's almost like a magic bullet.
Okay, Robert, anything to add to that, or based on Caltrans experience?
As far as that's one area, we do the overall. I don't know, since I I'm not on the state side. I don't know if they've actually have done it before and after, but like others, what we have seen early on was with great success, and just even the studies that have come out. So yeah, it's one of those where I know some districts have done some before and afters. I don't have any information at this point, but I'm confident that they're taking a look at each location, and seeing that and those benefits. But yeah, I really don't have information. But when I saw the initial installation there at Laurel Curve, when it went from 20, 30 accidents a year in wet conditions down to 0, it was quite an amazing thing. And even the local agencies, we've asked some of our early adopters for some information at their locations, and we're seeing the same results as well.
Robert, if I could ask kind of a follow-up to that, in terms of your work with the local agencies, any advice for local agencies that want to partner with their states on HFST site selection or installation?
Yeah, I would say, don't be afraid to call them up and ask for that help. Our thing is we've always told our local agencies who don't know anything about it is, go to the FHWA website, make sure you have a good spec. Don't reinvent the wheel. We always say that our spec is one that you want to start with because it's automated. It says calcite bauxite. Start with that, and then industry is always willing to help out a local agency to come out. We have a couple vendors. We have at least one vendor or one contractor out here that's more than happy to come to your agency to assist and provide his feedback. He's seen everything as far as pavement conditions and can give you help out. So, and even joining up with other agencies. One agency I know is could be more progressive than another. Reach out to your other local agencies to get some information, and really the bottom line is, don't just go with one site. Try and find multiple sites to get that benefit of lower cost and get the benefit overall on local roads. And like any local road, you're not going to make major improvements. It's going to be what you see is what you get. And to me, super elevations and all those things are going to be challenging at best. And so what you're going to be left with is really the high friction is probably your best option in many locations in local agencies, especially in the rural areas where, like others, 62% of our fatal and serious injuries are on local roads. So that's where we're really focusing on trying to get our local agencies to utilize this more and more, because roadway widenings and curve realignments are not going to happen here in California. Can't afford it.
All right, thank you, Robert. And thank you guys for being on. I know we're over time. We'll pay you overtime for this, I promise. We'll double what we paid you for the main webinar here. But really appreciate your time, guys. Thank you for all your input and your insight. Thank you for everybody who's logged in and listened to the webinar. As I mentioned, we're going to do another webinar probably in a couple of months. It'll be during the ATSA Expo in February. We're going to talk a little bit more about application practices and some lessons learned on that with actually placing the material and some lessons learned with that. So thank you all again for joining us. Huge thank you to our panelists for your time. You've given us a lot of good information, and really appreciate your time. And hope everybody has a good rest of your Tuesday afternoon. And thank you again for joining us.